It is that time of year again. Warm cocoa, scarves, and snuggles on the sofa. And there's nothing better than a good story. And the spooky railway yards on a cold October's night are the perfect place to get a good yarn. None knew this better than legendary writer Charles Dickens himself. There is no good introduction I can give to this literary god, and it's obvious in his workings that he was inspired by his world around him. For example, in Oliver Twist, he highlighted the horrors and the depravity of the workhouse, and in A Christmas Carol, we saw what greed was doing to people and highlighted the importance of keeping the spirit of Christmas in our hearts. But one event may have prompted him to produce a story that was rather different to the others. In fact, the event was said to affect him for the rest of his life. There were 3 viaducts heading out of Staplehurst station, and in 1865 all were in bad need of track repair and relaying. The job was given to the platelayers of the South Eastern Railway Company. It was simple enough. Replace the sleepers, the chairs and the rails when the line was not in passenger use, and remove only one length at a time. It was also easy enough for the experienced foreman to plan the work around the trains based on the timetables. All except one, that is, the tidal train. The train was used specifically to ferry people from the harbour to the city. Because the tide's times are always changing, so must the train times to ensure the train arrives at the same time as high tide and the boat entering the harbour. The foreman took note of the tidal train, and for that particular day, June the 9th. They wouldn't have to worry about the train until 5:20, giving them plenty of time to continue their work for the day. Except the foreman got it wrong. He read the wrong date and mistook the time. Instead of 5:20, the train would be bearing down on him at 3:15. Ironically, a carpenter was also supplied with the same timetable, and he probably would have noticed the mistake had his timetable not been run over by a passing engine and been cut in two. The regulations allowing trains to pass on lines that were being worked was very comprehensive. While the works were being undertaken and the platelayers had possession, a signalman had to be on the ground facing the direction of any approaching trains. He would place railway detonators at 250-yard intervals until the signalman got to 1,000 yards away. Once at the 1,000-yard mark, 2 further detonators would be placed 10 yards apart, and he would remain there with a red flag visible. It was also customary to report any repairs to the managers, so the managers can make the drivers, guards and firemen all working the line aware. Through witnesses and testimony, it seemed that the platelayers and the foreman cut vital corners and neglected to tell anyone of the work. Also, they were using just 2 of the detonators they had been given, saving the rest for a foggy day. On the 9th of June at the viaduct, the platelayers had replaced 29 of the 32 sleepers and were on the final 3. It was still morning, so they figured complete the 2 before breakfast and then the final one in the interval between the up train due at Staplehurst and a down train due at 4:15. It would work perfectly. The men got to work, but the foreman instructed the signalman to stand less than half of the 1,000-yard distance away the railway regulation required. They would easily be done before 4:15, so why waste the energy? Going back to the tidal train, it was this train that Charles Dickens was currently on. He was travelling with his friends back to London and was travelling first class. The train in fact only consisted of first and second class passengers, with guards occupying 2 luggage vans. As they approached the viaduct where the men were working, not one of the guards saw the red flag. The driver spotted it straight away and sounded the alarm to the guards. All 3 snapped into action, putting on their relevant brakes. But it was no good. The whistle must have terrified the platelayers as they scrambled to get out of the way as the engine bore upon them. There was nothing they could do as the engine hit the section they were working on, and the area of missing track that lay uselessly on the wayside. The engine, by a miracle, actually remained upright and managed to cross the bridge, but the carriages were not so lucky. They lay strewn and scattered, having fallen from the viaduct and onto the riverbank. Out of the 14 carriages pulled, over half were destroyed. Charles Dickens survived the accident, but when he clambered out of his carriage, what he saw scarred him. People lay injured all around. He helped the victims as best he could, giving comfort, with some dying in his arms. Scores of people were injured, with 10 passing away at the scene. Although he wasn't injured, Charles was severely shaken by the accident and lost his voice for over 2 weeks. After the incident, Charles was reluctant to board trains again, preferring other modes of transport. It was no coincidence that just 1 year after the accident, he wrote the famous short story, The Signalman, a story based upon his own personal experiences and several other previous railway incidents. Charles would continue writing right up until he passed, 5 years to the very day that the accident occurred. Charles's son blamed the author's stroke on the stress of the accident that day, stating that Charles never recovered from the shock and the immense feeling of survivor's guilt. It is said that authors can be inspired by anything, and it's tragic that such a brilliant mind was scarred by such a horrid accident. But he used his experiences to inspire, and in some ways cause a stir. And he certainly did that with The Signalman. Whoa! Below there! When he heard a voice was calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box with a flag in hand furled around its short pole. One would have thought, considering that the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But instead of looking up to where I stood on top of the steep cutting, nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know if it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that had I shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. Whoa! Below! From looking down the line he turned himself about again, and raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path I can come down and speak to you?" He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down upon him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had forced to draw me down, when such vapour as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and skimming away over the landscape. I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag that he had shown as the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause, from which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There, by the dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made as though a clammy stone had become oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance and compulsion which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw he was standing on the rails on the way which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he was waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand on his chin, and that the left elbow was rested on his right hand crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped for a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way, stepping out upon the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, and saw he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as I'd ever saw. On either way a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. The shorter perspective in the other direction terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture saw a barbarous depressing and foreboding air. So little sunlight was ever found its way to this spot, it had an earthly, deathly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck the chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome place to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention. When I looked down upon the yonder, a visitor was a rarity, I should suppose. Not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits of all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but as far as I am from sure of the terms I used, for besides I am not happy in opening any conversation. There is something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about it, as if something was missing from it, and then looked at me. That light wasn't part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice. Don't you know what it is? The monstrous thought came to my mind as I pursued those fixed eyes and faltering face. This was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since whether there may be an infection in his mind. In my turn I stepped back. But making the action, I detected in the eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. You look at me, I said, forcing a smile, as if you dread of me. I was doubtful, he returned, whether I'd seen you before. Where? He pointed to the red light and looked at it. There? I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound. Yes. My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear. I think I may, he rejoined. Yes, I'm sure I may. His manner cleared like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and with well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes. Was that to say? He had enough responsibility to bear. But exactfulness and watchfulness were what were required of him, and of actual work, manual labour, he had next to none. To change the signal, to trim the lights, to turn the iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Regarding those how many long, lonely hours, which I seemed to make much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped that into that form, and he had grown used to it. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. Under some conditions there could be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but in being all the times liable to be called by his electric bell, and such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than what I would suppose. He took me into his box. There was a fire, a desk for an official book, which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, and a little bell, which he had spoken. He had no complaint to offer about it. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand about the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set down this man one as safest of men to be employed in that capacity. But for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen colour. He turned his face towards the little bell, when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions he came back to the fire with an inexplicable air upon him, which I remarked, without being able to define. When were we so far asunder? Said I when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I'm afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined, in the low voice which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir. I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them. However, I look up at him quickly. "With what? What's your trouble?" "It's very difficult to impart, sir. Very, very difficult to speak of. If you ever make me another visit, I will try to tell you." "But I expressly intend to make you another visit." "Stay, when shall that be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I'll be on again tomorrow night." "I will come at 11. He thanked me and went out the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said in his particular low voice, "till you've found your way up. When you have found it, don't call out, and when you're at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well. And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, 'Holla, below there,' tonight?" "Heaven knows," said I. "I cried something to that effect." "No, not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "I admit those were just the very words. I said them, but no doubt because I saw you below." "For no other reason?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You have no other reason that were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of the rails, which was a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming down behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag the next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom, with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said, when I came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here's mine." With that we walked side by side to the box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. "I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, speaking in a tone a little above a whisper, "that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me." "That mistake?" "No, that's someone else." "Who is it?" "I don't know." "Like me?" "I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is always across the face. The right arm is waved, violently waved, this way." I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the most utmost passion and vehemence. "One moonlit night," said the man, "I was sitting here, when I heard a voice cry, 'Holla, below there!' I started up, looked from that door, and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse and shouting as it cried, 'Look out, look out!' And then again, 'Holla, below there, look out!' I caught up my lamp and turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, 'What's wrong? What's happened? Where?' It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping at the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up to it, and I had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away. Then it was gone." "Into the tunnel?" said I. "No, I ran on into the tunnel 500 yards. I stopped and I held my lamp above my head and saw the figure of the measured distance. I saw the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again faster. Then I'd run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me. And I looked all around. The red light was my own red light. I went up to the iron ladder to the galley atop of it, and I came down again and back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm was given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back. Both ways. All well. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger, tracing out my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figure's originating in disease of the delicate nerves of that minister to the functions of the eye were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom would become conscious of their nature of their affliction, and had been proved by it by experiments upon themselves. As to an imaginary cry, said I, but do listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley as we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who often paused on winter's nights, there alone, watching. But he would beg to remark that he was not finished. I asked his pardon, and he slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours the dead and the wounded were brought along through the tunnel over to the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. This was not to be denied, I rejoined, but it was a remarkable coincidence calculated deeply to impress his mind. But it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and that they must be taken into account dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure I must admit, I added, for I thought I saw he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me, men of common sense did not much allow for coincidences in making of ordinary calculations of life. He begged again to remark that he had not finished. Again I begged his pardon for having been betrayed into interruptions. This, he said, laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over my shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I have recovered from the surprise and the shock, when one morning as the day was breaking, I, standing by that door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me. Did it cry out? No. It was silent. Did it wave its arm? No. It leaned against the shaft of light with both hands before the face, like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen with such attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in, I sat down partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it turned me to faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me. The ghost was gone. But nothing followed. Nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger twice or thrice, giving me a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at a carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal to the driver stop. He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here a mere 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us. Involuntarily I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards which he had pointed to himself. True, sir, true, precisely as it happened, so I may tell it to you. I could think of nothing to say, to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up their story with a long, lamenting wail. He resumed. Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since then, there, now and again, by fits and starts. At the light? At the danger light. And what does it do? He repeated, if possible, with increased passion and vehemence, that the former gesticulation of, for Lord's goodness' sake, clear the way. He then went on, I I have no peace or rest of it. It calls to me, for many minutes together in its agonized manner. Below there, look out, look out. It stands waving at me. It rings my little bell. I caught at that. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here? And when you went to the door? Twice. Why, see, said I, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, and my ears were open to the bell, and if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it rung upon the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head. I have never made mistakes as to that yet, sir. I have never confused a spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost ring is a strange vibration in the bell that derives from nothing else, and I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it. And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out? It was there. Both times? Both times. Will you come to the door with me and look for it now? He bit his underlip as though he was somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There was the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. Do you see it? I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not much more so, perhaps, than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. No, he answered. It's not there. Agreed, said I. We went in again and shut the door and resumed our seats. By this time you will fully understand, sir, he said. What troubles me so dreadfully is the question of, what does the spectre mean? I was not sure, I told him. I did not fully understand. What's this warning against? He said, ruminating with his eyes on the fire, with only by times turning them on to me. What's the danger? Where's the danger? Where's the danger overhanging somewhere on the line? Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time, after what's gone before, but surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do? He pulled out a handkerchief and dried the drops from his heated forehead. If I telegraph danger on either side of me or on both, I can give no reason for it, he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. I should get into trouble, and it would do no good. They would think that I was mad. This is the way would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger, where? Message, don't know, but for God's sake take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? His pain of mind was most pitiful to see, was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed upon endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair across his head, and drawing his hands from outward across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress. Why not it tell me where the accident was to happen? If it must happen, why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could be averted? When on its second coming it hid its face, why not tell me instead, she is going to die, let them keep her from harm? If it came, on those two occasions, only to show me its warnings were true, and to so prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go to somebody with credit to be believed and power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, I had to do for some time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality and unreality in between us, I represented to him whoever thoroughly discharged of this duty must do well, and it at least is a comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand those confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make large demands on his attention. I left him at 2 in the morning. I had offered to stay through the night, but he wouldn't hear of it. That I more than once looked at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it. I see no reason to conceal, nor did I like the two sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration how ought I to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure. I had proved that the man would be more intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. But how long might he remain so, and in his state of mind? Although in a subordinate position, still he had held the most important trust, and would have, for instance, liked to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision. Unable to overcome a feeling that there must be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first being plain with myself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in these parts, and to take his opinion. A change of his time and duty would come around the next night, and he appraised me, and he would be off in the hour or two after sunrise, then on again as soon as the next sunset. I appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down, and I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour. I said myself half an hour on and half an hour back. It would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down, from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me, when upon the mouth of the tunnel I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this was the appearance was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom seemed to be rehearsing this gesture he had made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with the flashing of self-reproachful fear that the fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What's the matter?" I asked the man. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir." "Not the man I know?" "You'll recognise him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising the end of the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed. "Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just as broad as day. He had struck the light and just had the lamp in his hand as the engine came out of the tunnel. His back was towards her and she cut him down. That man drove her, showing how it had happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough black dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There were no time to check the speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were coming down upon him, and I called to him as loud as I could." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below there, look out, for God's sake clear the way.'" I started. Oh, it were a dreadful time, sir. I'd never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last. But it were no use. Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I may in closing it point out that the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included, not only were the words which our unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he had attached, but that only in my own mind, the gesticulation which he intimated.